The following episode was originally recorded for a private podcast as part of the Equipped for Life course. It has been edited for public release, but may reference training material from the Equipped for Life course. Hey, before we start the podcast, we wanted to give you a little bit of context for some stuff that we talked about that we never really actually explained when we were recording. Because again, conversations are interesting things. So Tim and I referenced this YouTuber who's become one of our favorite YouTubers, this guy named CGP Grey. So some of you have probably seen, like, he does like the kind of the animated educational videos.
Very fast talking.
Kind of geography related. He's got a really great voice. And he makes interesting videos. If you haven't seen any, but you're kind of curious about who this guy is that Tim and Josh are really into, he's got some amazing videos on voting systems. And
that's how I first was introduced to CGP.
Why the first past the post system that America uses is awful and like the worst. So I think that's really interesting. I basically agree with him. And he has another video called Humans Need Not Apply. That's kind of on where things might be going in our society with like artificial intelligence. Like those are really interesting videos and automation and things like that. But he also has two podcasts, one called Hello Internet, one called Cortex, and they're kind of both different. But I listen to those religiously. I love these podcasts. I was listening to them this morning and yesterday. So kind of some of the topics that came up in those latest episodes kind of came up in discussion, and then we kind of realized after we were done, oh, we never really said who those people are or what those podcasts are. So that's what they are. And if you like other podcasts, then you might want to check those out because I think they're really interesting.
And like, they're really entertaining people.
And you can tell, like, if you end up listening to those, you're going to see like what has really affected the way that Tim and I have kind of wanted to make this
totally
podcast.
Influenced our podcast.
Very, very influenced us. Just the kind of straight up, like, not a lot of music, not a lot of production, like just the kind of the two dudes talking or three dudes talking or three people talking or whatever, like that kind of just very informal style. We like that style a lot. And yeah, that's definitely influenced the way that we've made this podcast. They did a Cortex recently where they were answering basically a bunch of behind the scenes questions about the podcast, which are like, an hour and a half to 2 hours long, each one. Do you know how long they talk on FaceTime to get one of these podcasts done?
5 hours?
About 5 hours.
Wow.
And some of that is show prep, and a lot of it is like warm up and getting kind of psyched up and getting into this right place. Like they don't just jump into it. But it's like 5 or 6 hours. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect that.
It's longer than we take.
It's a lot longer than we take.
Their podcast is better than ours, though.
Their podcast is a lot better than ours. Oh, they're going to have I haven't heard the discussion yet, but they're setting up a discussion about spoilers because they just did the Star Wars episode. Mm-hmm. They did a total spoiler alert thing in the beginning. Like, we're doing tons of spoilers. And Brady got the spoiler in Force Awakens, who dies, spoiled for him before he saw them. Like he saw it like on opening day. But some jerk like on like YouTube comments was like going and just finding places, just randomly just typing, here's who dies and here's who kills. And like, just like these random things. And like, Gray was so upset, like morally outraged at this. Like they're like, this is one of the like worst, like immoral legal things you can do. It's like basically like take out like, all like the obvious things. But this is just like the tiny amount of pleasure you're getting out of this compared to how much you've made the movie experience worse for every person that's seen this is like crazy. And so like they've got this, so they're getting ready to have like a whole like discussion in general about like the whole spoiler alert thing. And Brady's got this view that spoiler alerts have kind of an expiration date. So like Usual Suspects and Sixth Sense are like kind of these like, it's such a big deal. The the twist at the end or whatever is such a big deal. Like at this point you can't spoil it. It's too late. It's too long ago. And Gray's like totally disagrees. It's like, no, there's like, and of course in his robot, like he's like, there's new people being born like there's people being manufactured all the time, like that have not seen the Sixth Sense yet, right? Like they're getting ready to have this whole.
That's interesting though, that example of like depravity. It reminds me of St. Augustine. So there's this great, really interesting story.
Are you gonna do a name dropper thing now?
No, it's not name dropping. I'm just like this. I'm crediting Augustine. So
Tim's just been working on his name dropper case this week.
It's in the Confessions in like book 2 or something.
Yeah.
he's talking about his youth, which sort of terrible person he was in his youth. Okay. And like one of his like big examples of this is just how awful a person I was, just nasty, sinful, right, was he stole some pears. Like stole some pears out of an orchard. Right? And I know like that sounds like, okay, like get over it. It's not that big a deal. But to him, this was like one of his most significant sins because he did it just for the pleasure of doing wrong. It was like a specific example of like, I didn't even want to eat them. I fed them to pigs later. Like it was just for I wanted to steal. I wanted to sin. And so I sinned.
Wow.
And so it was just like, it was, there's something pure about that sinfulness.
Yeah.
That really stands out. Like you would think, you know, his other sins would be worse than that.
Yeah.
And I feel like the person who's going around on YouTube putting out spoilers, it's kind of like the modern day Augustine and the pears. It's just to be malicious.
Up. You know this is messed up. It kind of like when they're talking about, you know, the Star Wars universe, it's kind of this idea. Like, isn't it kind of interesting that this is one of the only movie universes, like in almost every movie, you know, like if there's bad guys, they don't think they're bad guys. They think they're in the right. But here they're called the dark side. Like it's kind of like just calling yourself the bad guys. Come to the dark side. Come be a bad guy. Like it's kind of this like they basically know they're bad guys, right? Like when General Hux gives his Hitler speech, you're like, doesn't he? This is so intense. And there's like this big red thing behind you. There's like thousands of like, don't you know that you're the bad guy and you're just like reveling in it?
But because there's very clear like Hitler comparisons to that speech.
Yes.
But Hitler doesn't exist in that universe. It's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Yeah. So they don't have the Hitler connection.
Hitler ripped off General Hux is basically like
probably
the idea.
Yes.
Right.
Even like the dark side thing, I don't know if I agree with that. Really? Because like it's in a different. It's a culture without Star Wars, right? Where Darth Vader comes out, bum, 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 bum,
they don't have the Imperial March.
They don't have the Imperial March, and for all they know, like dark versus light, it's like maybe they think that we're just racist. They think all like light side. Oh, so you think that white people are better, and like something about
light privilege,
the versions of the Force. So like in the light side of the Force, you can't have absolute statements, which is just stupid.
Right.
So maybe like the dark side in their minds is what we think of as the light side.
So one of the main things that we wanted to do with this podcast when we started it was answer questions from people who are taking the course. And kind of we did a bunch of episodes that was more, topics that we were interested in covering as we kind of waited for questions to come in. But now we have a lot of questions. In fact, we've got more questions than we can hit today. So we're going to try to, I'm really hoping we can get through 4 of these because there's 4, I think, pretty interesting topics here.
We may have waited too long.
We may have waited a little bit too long. Well, the election happened. Like
That's true. We
had to talk about the election. Like there's just different things, and then all those other episodes we kind of recorded like a bunch in one day. And anyway,
I'm actually pretty excited about us doing this because this to me is like the personification of the difference between theater and film. Where like theater, you interact. Like you in the audience, you're sitting, you're going to watch a play. And you laugh at a certain point, and that affects the performers, or you boo at the villain, that kind of gives them energy or whatnot. It's like it's an interactive thing. You actually change what happens. Whereas film, you can scream at the television all you want, nothing changes.
Right.
So like when we recorded the videos for the course, that's like film. This is more like theater. Like people actually, it's as an ongoing entity. This podcast, people's questions and interactions with us change what it is.
It's like a complex organism or something.
It is something like that. So I'm excited.
Question number 1. This is Jim on the forum. He said, I know your focus is more of a one-on-one conversational dialogue, but is there any consideration of including anything regarding how things differ in a debate scenario? I assume he means including anything in this course. Granted, most debates involve established professionals on the topic, but some students might have opportunities in debate clubs or future political activities, or someone might find themselves addressing questions at a pro-life event that come from someone opposing the pro-life view. I know that there are some students for life clubs where they actually host full-on debates, but they don't bring in people. It's like the head of the pro-life club versus a professor or someone from the Planned Parenthood or the pro-choice club or something like that. He says, knowing that large audiences affect things, in a formal debate, you're less focused on changing the mind of the other debater, but rather to persuade an audience. It seems like a very different dynamic that might be interesting to address at some point. Large audiences aren't conducive to most people sharing deeply personal things that work well one-on-one.
Yeah, I think Jim has answered his own question
I know,
to
like
some
he
extent.
took like the main thing I would have said.
Well, there's more things to say, but like I think Jim is exactly right. Yeah. Something like anything going personal is not going to be the kind of direction you're going to go.
Yeah.
There's no room for that.
This is much more of a performance and less of this kind of like our voice, our style of dialogue that we advocate for is something that's very authentic, very transparent, and sometimes gets very personal because you're establishing rapport. And it's just like, it's good for us to be human with each other. And just a lot of that just doesn't play well in a debate where it's really a performance. And there's all these skills that if you're good at in a public debate, like I wouldn't even want you to do them in a dialogue, like being like really good at cross X, like or like the
Right.
cross examination portion thing. Like, don't do that in a dialogue.
Right.
That would be awful. Like, obviously, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah, and what we at Equal Rights Institute do is definitely we're dialogue focused, but that's not because we like think debate is inherently a bad thing.
Right.
Like debate is a fine thing and even a good thing when done well. It's just not what we do.
Right.
Debate is a good environment for ideas to clash in a really clear way when there's just really clear focus on the ideas when it's done well. It's something that we will probably do in the future. It's not something that we're doing right now. And the reason for that is that what we're focused on in our mission has to do with trying to change people's minds in one-on-one conversations. If you have an opportunity to do a debate or you have a particular talent for a debate, that's not like out of bounds. That's totally okay. What's not okay is treating your one-on-one conversation like it's a debate.
Yes.
A debate is a setting where it's a game. It's a game with rules and point scoring. It's okay to play that game.
Right.
And in a one-on-one conversation, there's no one there to count points except for you. Like nobody cares. And so if you come across and you have this great big rhetorical flourish that the other person's ignoring because they're not listening to you,
right.
That doesn't do anything.
Right.
In a debate, it's a good thing. It doesn't matter if your opponent is listening to you. You're trying to convince the audience. In a one-on-one conversation, don't play the debate game. It's not going to be helpful.
Yeah.
But debates are fine. So like our friend Trent Horn is wonderful at debates. He's like, I think my favorite pro-life like platform debater right now. I think he's really, really, really good.
Yeah.
He's really smart. And he's also very, very funny.
Yeah.
And in a debate, humor makes a big difference. And so that works out really well for Trent. Totally fine with debates. We're not anti-debate. But in a one-on-one conversation, we're anti-debate. The way that I think about the difference between the two things is that I think a dialogue basically is a conversation where the goal is to change the other person's mind, and a debate is a conversation where the goal is for your side of the argument to win. And there's some overlap. Like, so in both cases, you need to make arguments.
Right.
But there are things you should do in one that you shouldn't do in the other. So in a debate, you shouldn't take lots of time to listen to the other person to understand what they mean. Your time is too valuable.
It feels so counterintuitive.
I know. But this is how the game is played. You have to make the best use of your time. And so when the other person is talking, all you have to do is listen well enough to know how to defeat their arguments.
Right.
And I know that feels icky and terrible. That's just how the game is played.
I remember doing this when I did my public debates. I kind of used this strategy that I'd heard from Scott Klusendorf. I had a piece of paper in front of me and I had columns and I'm writing down like the arguments or talking points they're using, and I'm deciding while they're talking which ones am I going to respond to and in what order, and which ones is fine. I can just kind of let it go. Like, that's not the kind of active listening that we talk about on our course.
Right. Absolutely. And part of the reason for that is that in a debate, your goal is a general goal. Like you're trying to convince a large group of people who are all have different views and different kinds of perspectives. But in a dialogue, it's a personal goal. It's just directed at one person. So you have to listen to understand that person. In that context, it's good to ask follow-up clarification questions, even personal ones.
Yeah.
It's also good to allow the other person a thinking pause, like I wrote about in a blog post, to process what you said. Yeah. But in a debate, that's a bad use of your resources. It's a bad use of your time. And you're not a holier, better, nicer, more righteous debater if you give the audience or your opponent like these really long pauses where they can process what you're saying. That's not a good strategy.
Right. If you're listening to this and you haven't read Tim's Thinking Pauses piece yet, I'm going to link to it in the show notes. It's easily one of my favorite pieces that we published in the last year. Like it's something that is actually affecting me in my dialogues in a very particular way. I think I'm having better dialogues because of that piece. Let me move on to another question that we got from Kristine. I think this might have been the very first question we got after we published. We didn't even have the full course published yet, but we had published a few of the lesson videos as kind of on YouTube to give people kind of a sense of what it would be. And one of the videos that we released was the one on not making arguments with question marks.
Yeah.
And Kristine has some follow-up questions to that, and I'm kind of guessing that maybe some other people might have had similar questions. So I kind of want to go through. I'm interested in your takes. I've got some things that, like, C and I kind of emailed back and forth.
Sure.
And so it'll be interesting to see what you have to say. So Kristine noted... She said, this goes against the approach that groups like the Center for Bioethical Reform and Justice for All have been using for years, which is precisely a Socratic approach. So, like, right away, I just, like, we said this so many times in that video, but, like, we got to say it again. Like, we love JFA. JFA is awesome. This is an area of kind of respectful disagreement that we have with some people who do use questions differently than us.
Yes. And to be clear, so I haven't spent a lot of time seeing like the CBR folks dialogue. I have spent a lot of time with the Justice for All folks and watching them dialogue. Yeah. They're wonderful at dialogue. Yeah. Like really, really, really good at dialogue. But there's a respectful disagreement here. They do encourage people to make arguments with question marks. And I think that is a area of respectful disagreement. I think they would be even better at dialogue if they didn't do that.
Right.
One more thing, she mentioned like Socratic. I just want to comment on the Socratic method.
Okay.
So like the Socratic method, like I'm not like anti-Socrates. Like I'd be like, I'd like lose my philosophy diploma or something if I was anti-Socrates. Socrates is really good, but Socrates was a teacher. And I think it's very effective to teach using questions, because questions in a teaching environment, it forces someone to think.
Right.
But in a conversation where you have two peers at a functional level, you get two people, they're on equal footing. Right. And one person is trying to play the role of the teacher, and that can be frustrating for the person if the person isn't interested in learning. Right. So for instance, so I've talked about a conversation with a guy who I'm calling Chris about a year and a half ago. I've talked about this story a lot. He changed his mind in our conversation. He started off like really, really strongly pro-choice. And halfway through our conversation, I totally blew away his personhood argument. And he changed in that conversation. When we started off, we were in this totally like we're having a serious argument. It was friendly, but it was like ideas clashing. Yeah. And when he all of a sudden he knew like he was done. He admitted, I know when I'm beat, like you win. Right. And then we kept talking, but he had a different kind of posture. He was in the posture of a learner. Right. And so in that conversation, I did more of a Socratic kind of approach, because I was trying to help him learn, and he was open to learning. When you're talking to someone who doesn't feel like you're a source, like a teacher to them, then taking on okay, I'm going to teach you. And so doing everything with questions and making you think, that's not going to be as effective. They're going to be more put off by that.
Yeah. Kristine goes on, at JFA and CBR, we were taught that people are more likely to accept a conclusion if they answer the question themselves rather than having the statement or answer given to them. She says, it would have been great to have some examples of the difference between a leading question versus a clarifying question. For instance, when someone says, but a fetus isn't conscious yet, if we ask, what does yet imply? Or isn't their current lack of development merely a matter of how old they are? It seems that those questions would lead a thoughtful person to think. Or would you say there's an implied argument in the question that we should just respond with, that's because they're younger than older humans? I would have thought that declarative statements would be easier to dismiss than a question intended to lead them to the conclusion. What are your thoughts?
That's a really good question. I think that in a conversation where you have really good rapport, it's easier to get away with the argument with question mark kind of approach, because the person can overlook it. Right. The reason why we are so against making arguments with question marks is because it hurts your rapport. Right. And I'll get back to that in a little bit, but that's the basic concept.
We were very clear in the video. Yeah. This is not an absolute rule. This is a kind of a general guideline. Obviously there's going to be some exceptions.
And like sometimes it's good to take some of the rapport that you've built and to cash it in. Yeah. And like, okay, you've been really nice for a long time. Ask one really good, hard-hitting question that might be hard to process. Like that can be the right call sometimes. Yeah. Every conversation is a series of difficult judgment calls amidst prayer without ceasing.
Right.
And so certainly there are going to be times when it's going to be better to make the argument in a question format to try to make them think.
Right.
But that's an edgy move. When I've heard people advocate for using questions in this way and saying, hey, it's going to help people to process better than if you just make declarative statements at them, they're not advocating for just making arguments with question marks after you've built some rapport. They're advocating for doing that from the get-go.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're thinking strictly in terms of when a conversation is already like in a productive framework, that's okay. Sometimes that's right. I think they're seriously neglecting the impact of those kinds of questions on the rapport of the conversation.
Yeah.
If you're assuming that the person is receptive and is going to remain receptive throughout the conversation, then that's fine. The whole goal of not making arguments this way is trying to help the person to be receptive.
Yeah.
And so for a given person, they might be inclined to ignore you and you just saying, here's my argument, what do you think? They might be more inclined to just kind of move on and say, well, I don't have to really respond to that because you just made it as a statement. Right. I don't think that's usually true because I always follow these, here's my argument, just laying it on the table, here's what my argument is, what do you think about it? They still have to respond to that.
Yeah.
But it's in a less leading kind of way than a isn't. So if this is true, then isn't this the case? That isn't contraction. It's always a contraction. Doesn't this pull you along? Don't you want to believe what I believe? And aren't you going to feel silly if you say no? Like that kind of thing is in some cases intended, in other cases unintended side effect of making arguments with question marks.
I want us to respond to the examples, specific examples that C gives here of questions that C kind of thought would probably be helpful for a thoughtful person. But before we do that, C says, like, it would be helpful if I had some examples of like the difference here. Like, can you kind of comment? Like, we didn't give a ton of examples in the course video. Do you have some examples in your head of other arguments with question marks?
So I think one of the reasons we didn't get into it in the course video, and I think we would have explained this better if we were to re-record it today, is that I think basically any argument can be done in a question mark approach or a non-question mark approach.
Right.
So something like, so if this is true, then isn't this true?
Question mark.
Question mark. So if this is true, then doesn't this have to also be true? Doesn't this have to be true? As opposed to the way that I would do it is, so it seems to me like if this is true, then this would also be true. What do you think? You think I'm wrong? And like that's open-ended. But if you say, then doesn't this have to be true? You're signaling to them, if you say no, you've got the wrong answer, and I'm going to pound you for that in a minute.
Right.
Even if that's not what your intention is, that's how it comes across. That contraction comes across as leading. Right. So a more specific example of the kind of argument that you could make with a question mark would be something like this. If consciousness makes us persons, then aren't squirrels persons? Now, let me stop for a second. That's not a terrible question. Like as far as like arguments with question marks go, that's not that bad.
Pretty good one.
It's not that bad. Aren't squirrels persons? You're trying to pull them. In the right context, maybe what the person needs is a little bit of a rhetorical push. Mm-hmm. And that's complicated. Like when does a person actually benefit from some rhetorical pushing is a hard question. Maybe we should get back to that in another podcast. Yeah. Generally speaking, like especially if you're a beginner, like training wheels, don't go there. I would still prefer an alternative. So here's the alternative way to ask the same question. You say, so the problem is that if consciousness is the thing that makes us persons, then that would have some rough consequences. For instance, then squirrels are persons. What do you think? Or maybe even, do you think it's problematic for your view if it shows that squirrels are persons? Now that kind of question is an open question.
Right.
And if they're thinking, yeah, I think that squirrels are persons, I'm a vegan, and you ask, so what do you think? This seems like that would mean that squirrels are persons. Right. And they're going to feel more comfortable saying, yeah, that's my view. Yeah. If you say, if consciousness makes us persons, then aren't squirrels persons? It's like you're signaling to them, I'm going to beat up on you if you say the wrong thing. And that's what these contractions do.
This like implied attitude that kind of comes with it that makes people feel less like safe to respond transparently.
Correct. Pay attention to the contraction. You're leading them to agree with you. That contraction is pulling on them. Please don't misunderstand me. By all means, make the argument. Just drop the rhetoric, at least most of the time. If this is the case, then it seems like this is the case. That bothers me. Does it bother you?
Yeah.
That's an open-ended clarification question.
Right.
Like, notice the difference. That's open-ended. You aren't trying to make them swim rhetorically upstream if it doesn't bother them. The alternative approach makes them feel set up to fail either way. It's like they're caught on the horns of a dilemma.
Right.
And to some extent they are. But that approach makes people feel defensive. People don't like being set up to fail. So this makes their shields go up and they start thinking about how they can save face. And if there's a thing that I'm doing that is making them think about saving face, and I could have easily done something different that would have allowed them to be comfortable just being honest,
Right.
then I'm making a big mistake. Let people process their views without feeling like you're going to make them look like an idiot if they say the wrong thing. Now, don't misunderstand me. This is really important. Many pro-life advocates wouldn't point and laugh at them if they said that they think squirrels are persons.
Right.
That's not what I'm saying. But the pro-choice person feels like they would if the pro-life person takes the argument with a question mark approach.
Yeah.
If the pro-choice person feels like they are safe to process their view honestly, then it is much, 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 much more likely that they're going to change their mind. That's what this is all about.
Yeah. So I want to reread just a couple of sentences from Kristine's first question so we can respond specifically to our examples. He said, for instance, when someone says, but a fetus isn't conscious yet, if we ask, what does yet imply? Or isn't their current lack of development merely a matter of how old they are? It seems that those questions would lead a thoughtful person to think. Like for me, like for examples of leading, like we were very careful in the course not to call all arguments with question marks leading questions because some of them aren't, some of them just come across as one. But like as far as leading questions go, I'm not sure if I've heard very many more leading examples than what does yet imply. Like I think that would have a very negative effect on the other person you're talking to.
Also, it seems like it's misunderstanding their view. Like they say it's not conscious yet, right?
Right.
Okay, so the pro-choice person's view is probably you have to be conscious presently in order to be a person.
Right.
And so saying, but what does yet imply?
Right.
Well, the answer to that question is that one day it's going to be conscious if we don't kill it. What does yet imply seems like it's trying to make a bigger deal out of the fact that the fetus will at some point be conscious than the pro-choice person cares about. And like making this big like rhetorical aha moment
Right.
out of something that's not really an aha moment to the pro-choice person.
Right.
So honestly, I think that's just a bad question. I could ask that question in a nicer way. I don't want to. It's a bad question.
Right. It's not just a problem that there's a question mark at the end of the argument. The argument that you're trying to imply with this question mark is just a bad argument.
Yeah, like figure out why they think that consciousness matters in a gracious way and give a counterexample.
Right.
Squirrels are conscious. Or if what they mean by consciousness is a higher level thing, then it's something that newborns don't have. That's going to disprove their view. And just pointing out that at some point the fetus will become conscious doesn't disprove their view.
Yeah. So I responded to Kristine saying a lot of similar things to you. I actually got into the zoo thing. And so Kristine had some follow-up questions that, once again, I presume that some people could have. So she said, thanks, Josh. I guess I'll know more when I watch the videos, but are there any instances where you might use a leading question? Especially when the person voicing the answer to that question would progress the conversation significantly or lead to the next argument you want to make. Or what about when someone is playing philosopher and you know they know the answer but are just messing with you or dragging their intellectual feet for the sake of argument?
Well, those are two different questions.
Yes.
So are there any instances where you might use a leading question? If you said like argument with question mark, I would say yes. Like there are situations where I think that that's going to be the most clear way to make the argument. The person's going to receive it well,
Right.
that kind of thing. It's all judgment call kind of stuff.
Right.
But like specifically a leading question, like the way that I think about leading questions is that it's doing a really like stranglehold kind of like really pushing hard on someone
On purpose.
on purpose that I don't like. So like when I think leading question, I think when did you stop beating your wife? Like that kind of question.
Right.
I'm not sure what an example of a leading question is that I would want to use.
I'm kind of assuming that C means argument with question mark. Like it makes more sense to me that as a follow-up, as I've kind of said, like, look, I would respond with a couple of statements and I'd end with a clarification question, like something like that. Or I might ask a couple of clarification questions and then make a statement. I imagine it makes more sense to say, well, is there ever a time where you would use an argument with a question mark? To us, I think like, well, sure, every once in a while, but it's going to be the exception.
Yeah, it's going to be the exception, and it's going to be the never at the beginning of a conversation. At the beginning of a conversation, I'm doing everything in my power to bring their shields down, to try to help them to be receptive to the conversation, because it does not matter what arguments I make. It does not matter how brilliant I am if their heart state is not receptive, period. And so that's why practical dialogue tips matter so much. Is why we talk about this kind of thing so much. We make such a big stinking deal out of it, because they need to be receptive in order to hear the arguments.
Yeah.
The other question was something about a philosopher or something.
Oh, yeah. So he said, or what about when someone is playing philosopher and you know they know the answer but are just messing with you or dragging their intellectual feet for the sake of argument?
So I'm not sure what playing the philosopher means.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
I'm not sure if I should be insulted or not.
Could be the
probably not.
Could be the name dropper thing.
Maybe. So she's she's saying they know the answer, but they're not willing to admit it or something. Like they're playing rhetorical games,
and they're messing with you.
I think just call them out, like graciously. Say like it seems like you're just ignoring the question or something.
Here's the biographical experience I'm having right now. It feels like you're playing philosopher.
Yeah,
something like that.
And I think that's okay. If there's some kind of a subtle thing going on behind the scenes, it's okay to point to that and say, I kind of feel like this is happening. Is this happening?
Yeah.
And if they say no, then like maybe go on and see if things change.
Yeah.
Or it could be that they were slipping into that like at a subconscious level and they didn't realize it. Yeah. And by you pointing to it, that'll help them to like get out of it. Or it could be that they're just nasty, awful, pair stealing people, Star Wars spoiler quoting people, and they just want to be obnoxious. And I err on the side of like assuming the best of them.
Yeah.
But at some point, it's going to be okay. This is not a good use of your time.
Yeah.
And I don't think trying to put a stranglehold grip on someone who's trying to play the philosopher, whatever that means, is going to be a helpful call.
Yeah, I think this point when you do this kind of meta discussion thing, and part of the meta discussion is you're suggesting that at least it seems like this person is doing something kind of nasty. Like this is the point where like extra grace I think is really important, because otherwise it's just going to end up being a conversation ender. Like the person's just going to get frustrated or angry or feeling called out. But if you're really, really nice about it, like I feel like I don't know if this is what you're trying to do, but this is how it's coming across to me, so it's having an effect on me. Like, is that what you're going for, or am I just like missing it? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is like maybe sometimes the only way to even make it so there's a chance that the conversation will continue after that. So a lot of emphasis on grace there.
Totally agree.
Let's move on to another question. I had a really good phone call with a friend of mine who's been following my work for a long time, named Simon in Australia. So talking to Simon like by Skype or on the phone is really difficult because of time zones. Like it's like
I thought you were going to say his accent.
No, I love his accent. His accent's awesome. It's just is logistically
time zones are
tricky. But he asked it was such a good question, and I feel like I've received this question before. I don't think we've gotten it on the forum specifically. It was like this should go as something that we talk about on a podcast. And basically his question was, how do you deal with people when you're having dialogues who are equivocating or are like using words vaguely? It's like when we talk about equivocation, like we're talking about like when people are using like the same word, but they are using them in different ways. Like a pro-life person is using the term, human, and for the pro-life person in their head, that means person, and for the pro-choice person, that means biologically human and not person. And so like there's this kind of accidental miscommunication thing happening. And I think a lot of miscommunication comes from that. So he said, how do you deal with it when people are doing that or they're using words vaguely? How do you handle that well? I had a few thoughts for him. I'm kind of interested in what you would add. I talked about kind of this art of doing advanced dialogue stuff without seeming like you're doing advanced dialogue stuff. Like, can you know all this stuff and use it, but the other person doesn't see what you're doing?
You're like a Jedi wizard or something.
Right. Like, and this may seem sneaky. I'm going to try to explain why it's not as sneaky as it sounds right now. The example I gave, this is the best example I can think of. I need people to be kind of charitable with me about this, because this could really come across as like a humble brag kind of a thing, and it's really meant not to. I just don't know a better example. I don't talk about it very much publicly, but I play music. I play the piano, and so I've led worship a lot and things like that in churches. And there's this thing that in the last couple of years that I think I've gotten a lot better at, which is this art of playing very few notes. like at the quiet part of the song. And there'll be these times where like I've kind of figured out these intervals where I can play just 3 notes, but they're the perfect notes. Like they're like, I've tried every combination like in that key and I figured out, oh, this just sounds so kind of good. And there's this like, it's not flashy. It's not the kind of thing that if I do it, like it's not this like really fast, thing where everyone's like, "Ooh, good piano player." It's the part where I sound like maybe the worst piano player, or the most like moderately skilled or mediocre.
But it works
piano.
really well.
But it works so well, and I think it takes a lot of skill to have spent years trying all these different things and figure out these are the perfect notes.
It's like understated skill or something.
Yeah, something like that. So it's like, can you help people understand that there's an equivocation thing going on by asking them what they mean? Can you point out there is a post hoc ergo propter hoc thing going on without using Latin, without even pointing out that there is a logical fallacy going on? Can you just say it seems like you're saying that because this thing happened, that then this other thing happened, and there's this like they're connected in this way. Is that what you're trying to say? Or are you trying to or is there something else going on? Like in your mind, you're thinking that sounds like the post hoc ergo propter hoc thing, but this is I think it's easy.
For the sake of our listeners,
post hoc ergo propter hoc is the after, therefore, because of fallacy. Is the correlation, like the people are arguing that there is a correlation
there's like
when
a
maybe
chronological
there's not.
correlation, but it doesn't have to be a causal correlation.
Right.
Something like that.
And so it's like, I think it's not that hard to learn all the logical fallacies and point them out. What's hard and so much more effective is if you can not only not name the logical fallacy, don't even point out that there's a logical fallacy going on. Like be like a level kind of above that. And I don't think that this is like this sneaky thing. Like, I don't think this is like Inigo Montoya and the Men in Black, like fighting with their left hands. Like, it's not like the sneaky, they're just kind of
Have we already had a Princess Bride reference?
I don't know. I feel like maybe, I don't know if we have. It doesn't matter. We should have a lot of them. There's always a reason to, yeah. So I just think it's not sneaky. It's just like you're trying to be the most helpful. It is not helpful for people if they know, like when I go onto a campus, if I come across as this guy that has been talking professionally about abortion for 20 years, it's not going to be helpful for the other person. Like it'll create distance. But hopefully, if we're both actually open-minded, we can understand each other and not use Latin and not use big words. I think that's going to be helpful for people. What about you, Ad?
So I think all of that is great. And I think there's a really interesting kind of like meta moment here for the podcast, which is like I interpreted this question totally differently.
Did I do that thing where I didn't answer the right question?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I think you interpreted the question as an optimist would, and I interpreted the question as a pessimist would. So the version that the kind of person that you're talking about is a person who's equivocating unintentionally.
Right.
They're well-meaning. They're not trying to equivocate.
Right.
And what came to my mind is, all the people who are doing it on purpose. And to be fair, so the fact that I've got a background in philosophy means whenever someone has a problem with a philosophy major, they always bring them to me. And B, I think that God also just sends them to me. Like I'm the first person to talk to them, and there is always the philosopher guy. And so those people are more likely to be obnoxious, using verbal trickery and equivocating and that kind of thing. So that's been my experience. There's a lot of that.
I hear people right now thinking, well, maybe it's just that philosopher types, the obnoxious types, are more likely to come into an outrage and there's a post hoc ergo propter hoc thing going on right here. Like,
that's possible. I don't think that's what it is, because most people that come to the outreach are not philosopher types.
That's true.
But when the philosopher type comes, it's always to me. And so because of that, when I see this question, I think, oh, those philosophers who won't stop equivocating.
Maybe you look like
and doing
them.
verbal trickery. I don't know. Right. So what I was going to say is, all right, let's try and assume the best of them. let's try and assume that they're not doing it on purpose. Ask lots of questions. Right. Try to figure out what's going on. Be really patient. Is my advice to myself when I'm talking to someone who's doing this. And narrate the debate. Try to explain, here's what's going on. It seems like when you use this word in this context, it means this thing, and in this context, it means this thing.
Yeah.
I agree to not use Latin if you can possibly avoid it. I mean, equivocation is not Latin, but I don't think it's Latin.
I don't know. This probably comes from Latin at some point.
I don't know. We sound so ignorant right now.
Whatever. whatever.
We need a homeschooler who like did Latin to like help us with that. Anyway, you shouldn't. Equivocation is like a big multi-syllable word. You shouldn't use it either.
Yeah.
Latin or not. Like that's what I'm thinking about. Is like, okay, so like try to explain. It seems like this is what's going on. It seems like this is something that's happening totally unintentionally.
Right.
And if that's not effective, then I'd say it's time to move on. I wrote a blog post, I don't know, I think it was more than a year ago. It was like something like, don't be too nice.
Yeah.
And we used the picture of Puss in Boots from Shrek.
Right.
He's like looking all like sad, like, oh. So is that blog post. And the basically the point of this post is like, we're focused on dialogue and trying to be really gracious, but we're not trying to force people to be doormats.
Yeah.
Our goal in the conversation is to try to help the other person, try to be loving to the other person, and people have different needs. Sometimes people need a lot of patience, and sometimes people need a kick in the pants. Sometimes people need a gracious but firm hand. Yeah. Say what I've had sometimes is people have been really obnoxious or like really steamrolly, like when they just like try to like just interrupt you all the time.
Yeah.
And I've had to say, hey, I'm trying to have a nice conversation here. I'm trying to be really gracious, and you're being a jerk. And if you're going to be a jerk, then this isn't a good use of my time. Like, could we have a conversation where we take turns and have an exchange of ideas? Like, is that okay? And sometimes, like, and what I've had as a response to that is, yeah, I'm really sorry. I was being a jerk.
Yeah.
And like in one case I talked about in this blog post, like the guy like apologized over and over, just fallen over himself
For
over
the
and over.
rest of the conversation. Like, kept coming back to
because
it.
he felt bad about it. Sometimes it's actually a good thing to just call people out. So someone's being equivocating or they're intentionally being obnoxious, just say, it seems like you're playing games, and I don't want to play games.
Right.
Like, could we like get to what the issue is?
Can we have a real conversation, or are we just gonna, or is this just a game for you? If it's not a game for me. If you want to play a game, go play with someone else who wants to play a game. I don't want to play a game. I want to have a real conversation. And
so that, of course, we're in advanced dialogue territory. This is like training wheels are off. This is not something to jump to very quickly.
Yeah. Even though you might have this impulse that you want to jump to it really quickly because it feels really good.
Oh, yes. It feels great to call people out and be like, you're being a jerk. Aha. And like you have this kind of self-righteous feeling.
And the story that you tell later to other pro-lifers you'll get a way better response too.
Yeah, you told them, you showed them who's boss, like that kind of thing, which is what people want to hear. Don't do that. If you're like, here's a good rule of thumb. If you're thinking that now is the time to like not be too nice and to kind of stand up for yourself and you're feeling like righteous fury, you probably shouldn't.
As soon as fury is a part of it.
Like, I think if you're thinking you're like legitimately like you're calm and you're not sure how else to proceed and you think I think this is the most likely thing that's going to help this person, maybe go for it, but only after you take your time and try to clarify more graciously a couple times. Yeah. But at some point, it's appropriate for you to just not let them waste your time. I've had people actually tell me, the only reason I'm talking to you is I'm trying to waste your time so you don't talk to anybody else. I've had people tell me that. Like, you don't have to talk to those people. Like, that's okay.
Okay, now at this point in the show, I decided to read one more piece of listener mail because I thought that it would be a pretty quick one. We'd get through it really fast and in the podcast. And that actually ended up turning into about a half an hour long discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break here and I'm going to save that piece of listener mail for the next episode.